welcome to Lecture 2 of our series on the history and development of ideas in East Asian medicine. And today we're going to be talking about some of the ideas and concepts which emerge during the most ancient archaeologically recorded dynasty of China, which is the Shang Dynasty. It's a very, very old, long ago period of time. And we're going to look at some of the aspects of that culture and that society and that period of time just to see how maybe that influenced some of their medical ideas. How did they think about medicine and what was their socio-reality of that period, and how does that impact what East Asian medicine is today and how we receive it today. So let's jump over to our PowerPoint. So Shang Dynasty, the theme of the Shang Dynasty, the main concept is called ancestor medicine. So just to start off and to give some context, we're going to, even before jumping into the Shang Dynasty, we're going to just briefly mention the mythical period of time that even precedes the Shang Dynasty. Before the Shang Dynasty is a period of time in China that is very much shrouded in mystery. It's kind of lost to the times of history. It's so far back into the past that we don't really have a archaeological or written record of its existence. But in the most ancient texts of Chinese history, they do refer back to a mythical dynasty called the Xia Dynasty. And in the Xia Dynasty, there is a mythical story of this figure called Yu the Great, who was the mythical founder of the Xia Dynasty. And this dynasty preceded the Shang. It's so old, there's nothing that we can really pull from to know whether this was real or not. But as the mythical famous story goes, Yu the Great became famous and became the emperor because he was able to tame the severe catastrophic flooding of China and the fertile river valley of China. There is a gigantic river that runs through the most fertile area of China where a lot of the agriculture is. And one of the big repeating themes of Chinese culture and civilization is the ability to control the waters of that geography, which have a tendency to be extremely catastrophic. They would flood very often and cause untold amounts of damage to the people and the lands. And I think actually also this kind of theme resonates throughout the medicine, where as an acupuncturist, we are treating the channels of the body, we're treating the waters of the body, we're treating the flow of qi and blood and fluids. And so I just think it's an important and interesting thing to look at as sort of this mythological starting point for how the world is viewed. And this goes back even before the Shang Dynasty to the Xia Dynasty, where Yu the Great was, he became a famous mythological leader because he was able to do great works on the irrigation and the water control systems of China during this mythical period, and he's famous because of that. And whether he's real or not, we can't really say whether he was a real, actual, existing figure, but that is the mythological figure surrounding Yu the Great. And that this is a long, long time ago, because the Shang Dynasty existed, and this is the Shang Dynasty, not the Xia Dynasty. The Xia Dynasty is long before even the Shang Dynasty. It's before them. But the Shang Dynasty existed 1600 to 1100 BC approximately, which is so very old, and it arises along the Yellow River Valley. And this is like the sort of the beginnings of an agricultural and livestock and agrarian society where the people are sustained by their farming practices and their ability to grow food and raise domestic animals. And so the ability to calm the rivers and to use the waters in a way that actually is beneficial for society and doesn't destroy the livelihood and the the farmlands was extremely crucial and necessary. It becomes a repeating factor all through the many dynasties of China, where it is a primary responsibility of the emperor to have the capacity to control catastrophic flooding. If there were catastrophic floods, this is seen as a really bad omen. It's like the universe and the heavens are basically saying that this person is unfit to rule. It's a very inauspicious sign for the emperor, and it's very displeasing for the people because if they're being destroyed by catastrophic weather events, that is just bad for the entire society. It's like a state of chaos and disorder for the society. So it was a huge responsibility of the emperor throughout Chinese history to be able to control the water flows. And yeah, I just find so much similarity to that with the practice of acupuncture in general. And interestingly, the Yellow River's name comes from the large amount of yellow-colored silt which it carries. This is a picture of the Yellow River. It is a pretty raging, gnarly river. It is huge, and so yeah, that was a big deal in ancient China. So thought it's worth to mention. You know, that informs the worldview of the peoples of these time periods, being that is one of the main factors in their lives. So on the topic of the Shang Dynasty, we do have archaeological evidence of the Shang Dynasty's existence, and the archaeological evidence that we have includes oracle bones and turtle shell inscriptions, which are pictured here in these photos. And so what I mean by oracle bones and turtle shell inscriptions is the uh, the Shang Dynasty was a society that was very involved with using the practice of divination and oracles. And so they would inscribe maybe a question onto onto the bone of an ox or onto the shell of a turtle, and then they would heat up a metal poker and crack the shell or crack the bone, and depending on how the cracks formed on the bone, they would interpret that as an answer from the heavens or from some kind of divine spiritual source. It's like the pattern of the universe is being imprinted onto the bone and the shell, and it's giving them an answer to their question. So this is a very early form of divination and oracles, and so the emperor would maybe have his diviners and his oracles perform this ritual with these bones, and maybe they would ask questions that were very important to the security or the well-being of the empire at that moment in time, and they would actually make governmental decisions based off of these divination activities. We also have Bronze Age inscriptions. So there's these bronze ritual vessels which are inscribed with very ancient Chinese writing, often called, I think, seal script. It's a certain type of writing. It's almost predates Chinese as we know it. It looks a little bit different. It has a different artistic style. I actually really appreciate the aesthetic, artistic style of the old Chinese seal script, but it's that is kind of the antecedent to what we would now understand to be Chinese. This is an example of the bronze ritual vessels with inscriptions. And these are examples of some of the script that can be found on them. These are like rubbings of the scripts. And you can kind of see how maybe these early pictograms over time would evolve into what we now would term modern or classical, really, Chinese characters. Actually, there's a difference between first seal script, this is the oldest form of Chinese, and then traditional slash classical Chinese, which is kind of like the varieties of Chinese writing that was used throughout the dynastic periods. And then there's also modern Chinese, which is also sometimes called simplified Chinese, which varies from the written language as it was used throughout the many centuries and dynasties. And that's a product of our modern age. The language was changed in the contemporary period when the People's Republic of China took power. They underwent a project to change the language and simplify it, because throughout most of the time period of China, most people could not read. It was only the very elite stratum of society who were able to read and write, and they were the highly educated elites, and they were basically the ones with political power who were running the bureaucracy and the administration of China and the government and the empire. And so that all changed in the contemporary era with the People's Republic of China. For better or for worse, there's there's negatives and positives to bring up when it comes to that, which maybe we'll get into that in the much later lesson when we talk about that time period. But it's just interesting to note the evolution of the Chinese language, because the Chinese language is just like foundational to obviously Chinese medicine, East Asian culture, Chinese culture, and philosophy, and the evolution of all of the ideas that go into our medicine. It's embedded in the language itself, and I would even go so far as to say that like China is really like a written language book centric culture. It's almost like books are like the central component of ancient Chinese culture, and like the classic books are revered. It's really a book centric culture in a lot of ways, and that's just my interpretation. But I'm sure that other people would agree with that in some ways. But so kind of having a even just like the most basic understanding of like where the language came from and stuff. It's very useful to know that, because all of the medical ideas come from the language. So, continuing onwards with the Shang Dynasty, they practice ancestor worship and ancestor veneration, and they believed in a very real relationship between the living and the dead. So, the worldview of the Shang encompassed a community composed of the living and the dead. The existence of the dead was just as much a certainty as that of the living, and it was understood that both groups were dependent upon one another. Ancestors ruled the world, but they were dependent upon the living for provisions. If the living failed to fulfill these obligations, expressions of displeasure by the departed were inevitable. So this comes from our Unshelled text, our first chapter of our Unshelled text, talking about the Shang Dynasty, and this is an ancestor veneration, ancestor worship culture. So they would speak to the dead through these oracles. This is an example of an oracle turtle shell, where they would drill holes and subject the bone to heating, and the cracks would form and they would radiate outwards. This would be used to interpret the will of the ancestors or the heavenly deity, which they call T or D, as an oracle device for the upper strata of the Shang society. So another quote from our book is that ancestors of the kings were believed to have a direct influence on the actions of D, which is the supreme or divine ancestor slash the god of the Shang dynasty. And it was incumbent on the king to ascertain through the oracle their will, which is the will of the ancestors, and ascertain talk to the ancestors and ascertain what they think about diverse matters, and if necessary to exert pressure by means of words or material offerings. So they would perform offerings and sacrifices, and to this end a system of communication with ancestors and with the dead was established. So this is their worldview. They see themselves immersed in a world that is governed by the ancestors and the spirits of the dead. There is a direct real way to communicate with these forces, and these forces can impinge on the life of the living. So the dead can influence the living and the material conditions of the world. And so in the Shang Dynasty, uh, how this influences their conception of medicine was that the Shang were familiar with many different forms of disease, but they recognized only a very limited number of diseases. So this is like the causes of disease, and they would say that the primary cause of disease is you are cursed by an ancestor. So that is the main cause of disease, curse of an ancestor. Or displeasures of the ancestors. They are displeased. In other words, injury is caused by the evil actions of a third party. It's caused by the actions of the spirits and the ancestors and the dead. So how do you treat that? How do you treat an illness that's caused by the cursing of an ancestor or the displeasures of the ancestors and the spirits? Is their understanding of the causes of disease led the Shang to adopt what to them would be extremely rational preventative and therapeutic procedures. So they would forestall the displeasure of the ancestors by offering gifts and sacrifices and rituals, uh, offerings to the ancestors, and giving them these gifts would, in their minds, please the ancestors, and then the ancestors would not punish them. They would not be displeased. They would not curse them. They would placate the dead spirits that they suspected to be causing the illness. So, for instance, if someone was sick, maybe the emperor would call his diviners and say, "Hey, we need to ask the ancestors, like, who has cursed us? What ancestor has cursed us?" And they would write something down on the oracle bones, and they would perform the divination ritual, and maybe it would tell them that, oh, this curse, this ancestor is, so and so, this ancestor from a past generation. Oh, it's this ancestor, and then they would know, and they could perform an offering, they could perform a sacrifice for this ancestor to try to ameliorate the illness. They would also perform various kinds of exorcisms and incantations. It was a very shamanic culture. Uh, and so this is really about creating a harmonious relationship between the living and the dead. So they would perform small regular offerings, or they would perform lavish buryings. They would bury the dead with lavish, abundant gifts in these very lavish tombs. And these were all done with the idea that they were seeking to please the spirits and the deceased. They would hold celebrations, rituals, and gatherings, very ecstatic kinds of extravagant gatherings. And what Unschuld says is that social conventions used to distribute resources and build prestige and reduce the social mistrust and envy in a static zero growth agrarian society. This is how they would maintain social order, because if you think about it, it's like you had this very thin layer of an elite stratum of society who controlled all of the resources. Because in the Shang Dynasty, as an agrarian civilization, you would have, basically, it was almost like a very highly feudal situation where there were this very thin layer of extreme elites, like the emperor type of an individual and his next in commands, and the people that were essentially the ones who owned the production of the empire, like the land owning elite who were able to write and read, and they were the ones with all the power in society, and so they were the ones with all the resources, and so they didn't really, it wasn't like an industrial uh, civilization yet. They didn't really, there was no growth. There is no growth in a society like that, because there's only so many resources. It's every year you can grow X amount of crops and food and resources, and you can have X amount of animals, and all of these resources were very constrained, and so you can only have so much beyond that. There is really no way to get more than that because you're constrained by the amounts of land that you can work and the amounts of people that can work it, and the requirements to uphold that population with food and et cetera, et cetera. So, and all of the resources would go to the top. So this could create a situation where, that could lead to a lot of social unrest because there's poverty, there's misery in the lower stratums of society. So basically, what Unshold is saying here is that they would hold these extravagant events, these bonanzas, and there would be food and there would be rituals and sacrifices and these things to the dead, and it would kind of pacify the masses, and it would lead to a state where the society would remain at peace, ideally, and they can go on living in that scenario. And so the Shang believed that the deceased, when neglected, they would vent their hostilities on the living. Other causes of illness for the Shang. The Shang recognized evil winds and wind spirits. So this is like the beginning, this is the very beginning, like root seed kernel of what will slowly evolve into perhaps like the natural philosophy, which gives rise to concepts like wind, which is feng in Chinese, or qi, and the ideas that we come to know as like East Asian medicine concepts and Chinese medicine ideas like qi. So those kinds of concepts, you might be able to trace them back to this very early beginning intuition of there are evils, there are evil spirits and evil demons in the wind. You can kind of imagine, like, maybe this is real or not, but you can kind of maybe put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who lived in such a far removed um, point in time, and they didn't know what wind was. We now have science. We can be like, oh, it's the movement of particles from high pressure to low pressure, and we can rationalize it with our socio reality and the knowledge that we have. But if you were living in 1500 BC, and you're experiencing extreme weather scenarios and you're living kind of in a precarious situation, there's not a lot of resources, it's like a crazy storm, a flood could destroy your whole town. It could destroy the harvest and the crops for the whole year. It could make everybody starve to death that year. It could be absolutely catastrophic, and you don't know what that is. You don't know what the wind is. I could easily see that being interpreted as something like, you've been cursed by your ancestors. You've been absolutely, there are demons and evils in the wind. I don't know if you've ever been caught outside in the middle of the night, in the pitch black, in the woods, and there's a crazy storm going on, and it's like, it's a scary, natural event. The elements are fierce and scary and pretty insane. And so I just imagine myself, like, put myself in those people's shoes for a little bit, like what that must have been like. How do you interpret that kind of stuff, that kind of reality that you're placed in without any context? So I imagine this is kind of like, this is the reality that they use to rationalize, like, what is happening to me. How do people get sick? What is wind? What is this stuff? It's such a raw experience that is, the wind is one of those things that has been with humanity since the very onset of the first humans. They're out there in the world and they're experiencing the weather and the natural forces and the wind. So it makes a lot of sense to me that they would interpret the wind as an evil spirit or an evil wind spirit of some kind. And so it gives rise to this very shamanic culture, and there are these individuals which are referred to as Wu. These are like the shamans of the society. So the Wu shamans, they would perform the rites, which would influence the deity. Ti, to cause good winds or to drive out an evil wind. And these ideas, even though this is originating in 1500 BC and before, these ideas don't go away. This idea of an evil wind or at some specific time of the year there's supposed to be this kind of wind and maybe not that kind of wind. There's a certain type of, they come up with this whole idea of like there should be a proper type of wind at this point in time. And if the wrong type of weather happens, that is a very bad omen. That means that there's a much more likely chance of disease. These ideas ripple out and resonate even into the future when the more sophisticated types of East Asian medicine ideas are developed using ideas like qi as their basis. So even though these are kind of like the most prehistoric types of ideas, they that's the thing about East Asian medicine is it's a very pluralistic, syncretistic society and way of all these ideas kind of come together. They never really like go away. They all just sort of live together. So these ideas of evil winds and ancestor spirits and demons, and then the ideas of shamans being able to influence the natural world and perform rituals, and even there are ideas of black magic, and like you could do magic for evil as well. And there's actually a very long and interesting history of people performing what you could call black magic in China. There's a concept called gu, which is also known as gu syndrome, and we'll cover that topic more in the next lesson. But when we speak about the next type of ideas that come during the Zhou dynasty, but this all kind of originates in the deep recesses and the past of the Shang dynasty. And it's just important to note that wind, the idea of wind, throughout all of East Asian medicine history to the present, remains an important etiological principle in East Asian medicine. It's often considered a direct precursor for the concept of qi, as in like wind, the idea of wind evolved over time to become what we now call qi. Even though they're not the same, it evolves into the idea of qi. So even in the classics in acupuncture, they say wind is the cause of the 100 diseases, and wind is a important principle and concept throughout all of East Asian medicine. You can get struck by wind, like they would call a stroke, like an attack of you're hit by internal wind, or you could get hit by external wind and it could cause a problem, maybe like Bell's palsy or something. Or there are all these ideas about wind as a cause of disease, but long ago in the past, it all sort of starts here in this very old, like half mythological dynasty called the Shang Dynasty, where they perceived of the universe in this way. So the healers and the medicine people of the Shang Dynasty, they would practice what we could kind of call ancestor therapy. So it's a type of healer totally different from what we are familiar with. Ancestor therapy neither knew nor required a physician who directed his attention to the patient and carried out medical therapy. So it's sort of like the ancestor therapy was like a social therapy. It's like by performing these rituals and doing these sacrifices, they're harmonizing and adjusting the relationship that they believe exists between the living and the society that they live in, and the dead and the society of the dead. So in that sense, the king or the emperor, the head of the empire, could be kind of viewed as like the main practitioner and the main patient as the ancestor therapy. He was the one practicing and doing the oracles and the sacrifices and organizing these events, but also he's the direct connection. It's like he is the channel for the living and the dead to communicate. He's the intermediary. He's maybe like the top dog shaman, if you will. So in a sense, the leader and the king and the emperor of the Shang dynasty was like the physician for the whole population. You can look at it that way. That's how kind of Unscholl describes it. So this is the shortest lecture of the series because I think, it's the furthest removed in time and history, and also in culture from our own period of time. We only have so much information available about it. Um, and the rest of the lectures will be much more of what we really think of as like Chinese or East Asian medicine proper, because that gets closer to the real like formulation of the ideas, and we're going to be going real in depth into it. I can't wait. But in conclusion, about the Shang dynasty, what we can say is we only know some of the practices of the elite. We really don't have a lot of evidence. Like I said, we have like bones and some bronze vessels. So, we don't have a lot of evidence, but we know some practices of the elite and the upper strata of the Shang dynasty were limited by that evidence, by that lack of evidence. It's such an old culture, but very interesting nonetheless. And we can say that the Shang practiced ancestor worship, and they viewed illness, disease, and ancestor therapy through the lens of their socio-reality, and that this was conditioned by their time, their social context, and factors such as their agrarian culture. We can say that the Shang's cultural influence still persists in Chinese culture and East Asian medicine to this day. In many ways, like there are many aspects of spirits in East Asian medicine. There are aspects of ancestor reverence and worship in the culture of China and East Asia. And there is still to this day the practice of shamanistic, basically shamanistic practices and rituals and oracles. This stuff never goes away. It's all part of the culture and the history and the medicine in a sense. Even if it's not at the center of what we would call East Asian medicine today, it's still one of those bubbles in that pluralistic group of ideas. And so spirits, Wu shamans, black magic, and goo, while they kind of have their origin in the Shang dynasty in the very ancient past, we're going to talk about them much more in the next lesson of the Zhou dynasty, where those kinds of things really kind of develop a little bit and become we can go a little bit deeper into them. As far as the divination and the oracle practices, those concepts, they continue to persist and transform into later eras of Chinese culture, and like in the Han Dynasty and beyond. So when we think of that stuff, we can think about, for instance, the book of the I Ching, which is one of the most important, perhaps the most important book for all of Chinese culture in some ways. We can think about how that might influence and develop concepts such as feng shui, which is the movement of optimal qi flows in on the earth and in human bodies. So all of this kind of divinatory oracular stuff kind of evolves and influences the later concepts of the medicine. We can also take from this lecture that wind is a really important concept. So we can think about wind as an important precursor to the concept that evolves into qi. So that's a huge takeaway. And we're going to see that, especially as we look at Confucianism, we're going to see that ancestor veneration will continue to be influential. And we can see this in Confucianism, which it has a very powerful focus on this idea called filial piety, which is like the importance of reverence and respect for your family and your ancestors and your parents, and being a good son or daughter. And this places a huge importance on the family and familial duty and all of that responsibility that comes with that as a member of a family and a society. That's a huge component of Confucianism. We're going to talk about that during the Confucius lecture for a bit. But I think really when it comes to the ancestor stuff, one takeaway too that might not be on here that I'll just mention is that there is just an aspect of Chinese and East Asian culture which is very oriented to looking to the past, looking to the ancestors, looking to the classics, looking to the great periods of civilization, the heights of previous dynasties. There is a very important, powerful strain of thought, and this runs importantly through Confucianism, as we're going to see for a bit in the next few lessons, where it is a constant theme where the Chinese look back to the past for inspiration and for wisdom, and there's a conflict there because some people want to look ahead. They say, "Hey, out with the old, in with the new." But other people say, "No, the new is misguided. We need to look to the old. That is where the truth is and the answers and the good is, because we can look to these examples of our ancestors and we can revere their models." And so that creates a conflict in Chinese society and Chinese culture, which persisted and persists to this day. But I just want to mention that because it kind of all goes back to the Shang Dynasty with their focus on the previous generations and the ancestors and the dead and the reverence for that. So that's it for this lecture of the Shang Dynasty. I hope that was illuminating. This is the very beginnings of East Asian medicine. It's shrouded in like the fog of history and the fog of time. We only have just little bits and pieces that we can reconstruct into a coherent worldview and to try to understand the socio-reality of these people. But those are the ways that I would say that these ideas still reverberate and resonate through the medicine today and through the culture today. So thank you for tuning in, and next lesson we're going to jump in with the Shang or with the Zhou dynasty and look at some concepts called demonological medicine as the spirits evolve into more of a demonological worldview. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and I will see you for the next lecture.